Hello and welcome to the 2016 World Bank Group and IMF annual meetings. I'm joined today by Dimitris Tsitsiragos, who is the Vice President of the IFC's Global Client Services. Dimitris, welcome to the View From series.
Thank you.
I want to talk to you today about sort of the investment landscape across Africa and the way it has changed in the last couple of years. Given that we've seen a big slowdown in the major economies, including Nigeria and South Africa and Egypt, to what extent has that impacted investor interest across the continent?
Yeah, it's true that the economy in Africa, I think from north to south, has slowed down considerably. You know, in North Africa, you still have to deal with the Arab Spring after effects and the whole transition process. I think in the rest of sub-Saharan Africa, you have to deal with the impact of lower commodity prices and also foreign exchange movements, which have led to a slowdown of the economies. As a result, what one can see is that investment has slowed down in many of these places. Now, in terms of investor perception, I do not think that this investor perception has changed. I think in North Africa, the difference is that between North and Sub-Saharan Africa is the concerns that people have to deal with. But there are also some common elements. The long-term potential is there, so the attractiveness of Africa as an investment destination remains. The timing of the investments, I think, has been delayed as investors are looking for the turnaround. Also in North Africa, you have to deal with political risk, which is much higher than, is perceived to be higher than the rest of Sub-Saharan Africa. But in the long term, Africa as a continent has huge potential. It's a young population. Its urbanization is becoming more and more of a phenomenon, and it's natural as the economies are growing. So from an investor perspective, this is it's one of the last remaining attractive markets where you can still sustain large, high numbers of growth, and you can develop, you can enter new markets and you can generate, I would say, significant profits. So in conclusion, I would say Africa is still an attractive investment destination, but I think it's going to take some time, and it's going to take also some work from the governments, the host governments, to put the necessary reforms in place so that they attract investors again.
Now, you mentioned that longer-term growth story is still in place, it's still there, and we've heard a lot about this so far at the annual meetings, particularly around the prospects and potential of investments in infrastructure in some of these key economies. What role can the private sector play in, I guess, progressing these kinds of goals forward, and which sectors offer perhaps some of the most promising investment opportunities looking ahead?
Well, I would break it, the investment opportunities, I would break them down in two areas. I think the one is investments in infrastructure. And Africa as a continent lags in infrastructure compared to all the other continents. Access to power is a very big challenge. So it also presents a big opportunity. Governments' fiscal balances have deteriorated, so as a result of it, it is very difficult for governments to take a lot of the infrastructure investments on their budget. So what one sees is that this creates opportunity for the private sector to step in and work hand in hand together with the government to take on some of these challenges. This, I think, requires capacity on the level of the governments and also requires reforms in a number of sectors. I think what we see, a number of African countries, they're doing away with subsidies. They're trying to look at the financial health of a lot of their utilities. At the same time, what countries are putting in place is regimes that's going to make it more attractive for the private sector investor to come in and look at opportunities to provide infrastructure services. So I think that's a big opportunity there, and this is one that can be filled by the private sector. But now when it comes down to other investment opportunities, I think people will sometimes forget, people like we all forget that Africa also has an emerging middle class. Africa has grown in recent years. Income levels have gone up across the board. So you see a lot of opportunities, I would say, in the services sector and consumer goods. These are areas that in many ways for Africa, I see them as very attractive opportunities. And I think that's where there's still quite a lot of activity, and a lot of it is domestic driven.
Okay. Now, Dimitris, you mentioned a little earlier that this is an opportunity for governments to achieve reform and to pursue much needed reforms in terms of diversifying their economies and perhaps opening up their economies to investments. How much progress have you seen on this front over the last year or two, and do you think this has been a real step change in terms of the reform process?
Progress has been relatively slow, I would say. I think a lot of governments in the region recognize the challenges. They recognize what they need to do. A number of positive steps have been taken across Africa. I talked earlier about subsidies and doing away with subsidies. That I think we think as World Bank Group that this is it's a step in the right direction. You see a number of governments that they've created a regime, that supports investors. I mean, for me, one of the best examples and one of the big successes of IFC is what we've had done in the power sector in Côte d'Ivoire, where the private sector has stepped in, is the biggest provider of power. Côte d'Ivoire, which is an FCS country, has today power almost on Abidjan, has power almost continuously, which is very different than the rest of Africa. So that shows that if the reforms are implemented, opportunities are created, and the investors follow. So we see that this is the direction, and this is what we think government should do. You have an opportunity today because a lot of the commodity exporters, they have to make the structural adjustments and they have to look at their fiscal balances, and we're hopeful that a lot of these reforms will take place.
Dimitris, thank you for your time.
Thank you for the invitation.